The summer of 1917 had settled over France like a restless fog, lingering over the shattered earth of the Western Front. Trenches carved into mud, cries that blended with the thunder of distant shells, and the metallic scent of blood clinging to the wind. It was in this theater of chaos that Clara Whitmore, a 26-year-old nurse from Virginia, had found herself. She had volunteered in Washington, D.C. the year prior, moved by newspaper headlines and a fierce sense of duty that burned hotter than fear. Her father, a retired military doctor, had begged her to remain stateside. "You can do just as much good at the hospital in Richmond," he said. But Clara's heart was already on a battlefield she had never seen. By June, she had arrived at a makeshift hospital outside Verdun, assigned to a narrow canvas tent barely wide enough to fit the cots. She had never imagined what war truly looked like until that first night, when she scrubbed a soldier's blood off her apron with trembling hands and tried not to cry. Not because of the horror, but because she had never felt more needed. Each day blurred into the next. Clara's world shrunk to wound dressings, whispered prayers, and the ever-present roar of the guns. Yet even amid the carnage, she kept a diary, a simple brown leather-bound book, tucked carefully under her cot, hidden from the chaos. In it, she wrote about the soldiers who died with their hands in hers, about her growing fear that the world would forget them, and sometimes, when she dared, about Captain Thomas Everett, the young infantry officer with ocean-colored eyes, who had first spoken to her while she stitched up a gash on his forearm. They would share coffee when time allowed, bitter and far too hot. In the early dawn, before new wounded arrived, they would sit on overturned crates and speak of Virginia, of home, of peace. "Do you think," Thomas once asked, "people will even remember this place?" Clara didn't answer. She didn't want to lie. By mid-July, the fighting round Verdun intensified. The German offensive, brutal and unrelenting, forced the hospital to relocate twice in less than a week. Clara moved with the wounded, often under fire, never questioning her orders. On the night of July 27th, she was assigned to accompany a transport convoy carrying the most critical patients to a new facility near Bar-la-Duck. That was the last time anyone saw her. The convoy reached the destination. The soldiers did, but Clara didn't. At first, they thought she had simply missed the transfer, that she had stayed behind to assist others. But as days turned to weeks, the Red Cross listed her as missing in action. Her father received a telegram. Her belongings were returned except for her diary, which no one could find. Back in Virginia, her absence became a scar that never fully healed. The Whitmore family buried an empty casket in their family plot. A brass plaque with her name was installed at the local war memorial, and in 1968-51, years later, a young woman named Margaret Evans, recently returned from teaching abroad, inherited the old Whitmore house from a distant cousin. While sorting through the dust-laden attic and clearing the upstairs bedrooms, she found an old iron bed pushed against the wall. Beneath it, barely visible in the shadows, was a leather-bound book, its edges worn, its pages curled with age. When she opened it, the name C. Whitmore stared back at her in delicate handwriting. What she had just uncovered was not just a diary. It was a time capsule, a witness, and perhaps a long-lost answer. The diary smelled faintly of mildew and rosewater scent that clung to the pages, like a memory refusing to fade. Margaret Evans, barely 30, sat cross-legged on the wooden floor of the upstairs bedroom in the Whitmore estate, sunlight falling in angled beams through lace curtains. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the first few pages, careful not to tear the delicate paper. Each entry was dated, and each one bore the elegant handwriting of Clara Whitmore, the woman whose face Margaret had seen only once before, in a faded family portrait hanging in the hall. Clara had always been a mystery in family whispers. She was lost in France, an elderly cousin had once muttered, "Never found, brave girl." But now, through these entries, Clara wasn't just a name, she was alive again. April 5, 1917, we set up the tents today. Mud seeps into everything. I stitched up my first soldier. His hand shook the whole time, but he didn't cry. Neither did I. I think I'm finally ready for this. The entries were vivid. Clara described the smell of iodine, the thunder of artillery in the distance, and the prayers murmured beside dying men. There was no bitterness in her words, only determination. And underneath it all, an aching loneliness that seeped into every page. Margaret felt herself pulled into the past, walking alongside Clara through the war. She flipped further, stopping when a name appeared again and again. Thomas Everett. May 18, 1917. Captain Everett asked if I missed home. I told him I missed hot cornbread and my father's humming. He laughed, said he missed the way the fields in Kentucky smelled before a storm. We sat in silence after that. I didn't want the moment to end. As Margaret read, her heart began to pound. This wasn't just a diary, it was a love story, written between the folds of duty and death. That the entries grew more urgent around late July. Clara spoke of the increased German shelling, of the chaos in the relocation orders, of injured soldiers being carried on makeshift stretchers, and then the final entry, July 27, 1917. They need help loading the trucks. I'm going with the last convoy. It's dangerous, but they need every hand. Thomas kissed my cheek this morning and said he'd write me a letter for every day I'm gone. I didn't cry, not until now. Margaret stared at the page for several minutes. That was it. No goodbye, no ending, just silence after that. She closed the diary carefully and set it on her lap, her mind racing. Clara had vanished on that very day. This book had been hidden under a bed in her family home for over 50 years. How did it get there? Who brought it back? That evening, Margaret made a pot of coffee and sat at her kitchen table, a notebook open in front of her. She began writing down names, dates, locations. She underlined Thomas Everett 3 times. The mystery wasn't solved. It had only just begun. She decided she would find out what happened to Clara Whitmore, not just for herself, but because Clara's voice had finally returned from the war and it deserved to be heard. The next morning, Margaret returned to the attic, heart pounding. The diary had left her sleepless, haunted by Clara's final entry. She scoured every inch of the small room, fingers trailing across dust-covered floorboards, behind crates, and beneath forgotten trunks. Nothing. No envelopes, no photos, no trace of the letters Captain Thomas Everett promised to send. Back in town, she visited the local historical society, a small building with creaky wooden floors and shelves lined with yellowing maps and war records. Margaret approached the archivist, a soft-spoken man named Harold, with graying hair and a love for obscure footnotes. I'm looking for any information on a nurse named Clara Whitmore, she said. She served near the Western Front, vanished in July of 1917. Her family lived here in Kentucky. Harold blinked, surprised. Clara, I remembered the name. Wait here. He disappeared behind a door and returned minutes later with a slim folder. Inside were newspaper clippings and a single photograph. Clara in uniform, standing beside a man in military dress, his eyes intense, his arm around her shoulder in a way that said they had shared something more than duty. Is that Captain Everett? Margaret asked. Harold nodded. That's the only known photo of them together. Rumor was they were in love. He returned from the war in early 1918, never married, spent most of his life running a small post office in Virginia. Did he ever speak of Clara? Not publicly, but according to a letter we archived years ago, he used to walk to the train station every week for decades, hoping for a letter, or perhaps hoping to see her step off a train one day. Margaret felt her breath hitch. She held the photo like it was sacred. That night, Margaret called her grandmother, Eleonora, woman in her 80s, with a sharp mind and a memory like a locked chest. Eleanor was the niece of Clara's younger brother. You're digging up ghosts, Eleanor said gently, after hearing about the diary. They deserve to be found, Margaret replied. There was a long pause. Then Eleanor's voice softened. Clara's father never forgave himself. When the war ended and there was no word, he wrote letters to every hospital from France to Belgium. Nothing ever came back. He died in '39, still waiting for her. Do you remember anything? Anything at all? I remember a locked drawer in his desk. My mother once told me he kept all of Clara's letters there, but it was lost in a fire in 1945. Another thread vanished in flame. Still, Margaret refused to give up. She drove to Virginia that weekend. The old post office where Thomas Everett had worked was now a bakery. But in the town archive, she found something unexpected. Everett's military pension file. It contained copies of letters he had written to the army, to the Red Cross, and, most painfully, to Clara. December 12, 1918. Dearest Clara, every day I walk past the station and wonder if you'll be there. They told me you were on the final convoy, that it was attacked, but they found no body, no tags. That means something, doesn't it? You always said hope was stronger than pain. I'm still holding on to it. Yours, Thomas. Margaret's tears blurred the words. There it was, the grief of a man who waited, who never truly left the war. And suddenly, a new question emerged. If Clara's diary had been found under a bed in Kentucky, had she returned home without anyone knowing? Or had someone else brought it back? Margaret stared at the photo again. There was more to this story, and now she needed to know everything. In the quiet hours of the next morning, Margaret returned to the old farmhouse with a sense of urgency she couldn't explain. The questions from the previous day swirled in her mind like a storm. Had Clara made it back to the US? Had someone retrieved her diary after the war? And why had no one known? She brought the photograph of Clara and Captain Everett with her, hoping it might trigger a memory or recognition in someone. The farmhouse stood still beneath the soft grey sky, the porch creaking gently in the breeze. It was empty again, just as silent and heavy as before. Margaret went straight to the attic. As she climbed, something stopped her midway. A faint knock from below. She turned back, heart skipping. A neighbor, perhaps. At the door stood an elderly man with thick glasses and a cane, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his gaze alert. "You're the one poking around Clara's place?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "I found her diary. Are you?" He extended a wrinkled hand. "Named Louis Hayes. My mother was Clara's cousin. I used to visit here as a boy. Saw the light on yesterday. Figured someone was finally ready to talk about her." Margaret led him to the parlor, heart pounding. "Did Clara come back after the war?" she asked softly. Louis shook his head. "No one ever saw her again. But," there were whispers, "my mother said Clara had sent one final letter, said she was wounded, but alive, that she'd be coming home by summer 1918. Did she say where she was?" "No return address, just signed with a cross. That's how she used to sign letters to my mother when they were kids." Louis glanced at the ceiling. This house was locked up for years, but sometimes folks claimed to see light up there, even when the place was supposed to be empty. Margaret felt a chill. "After her parents passed," he continued, "the house was inherited by a distant cousin. He boarded it up, said it held too much sorrow." Margaret climbed back to the attic with Louis behind her, slower now. When they reached the space, she pointed to the spot where the diary had been found. Louis stood quietly, taking it all in. "There used to be a bed over there," he said, motioning to a sun-bleached rectangle on the wooden floor. "That's where her mother used to sit, and so, waiting for letters that never came." Margaret opened the diary again and read one passage aloud. "June 4th, 1917, the explosions keep me awake. I pressed the locket to my chest and tried to remember what Thomas smelled like. He said he'd find me after the war. I have to believe that. Hope is all I have left." Louis wiped at his eyes. That locket was passed down through the family. Number 1 knew where it came from, just that it belonged to Clara. "Do you still have it?" Margaret asked, hopeful. He nodded. "At home, in a box with some old medals." Margaret followed Louis back to his modest home nearby. Inside a small wooden box were several trinkets, and at the bottom, a delicate silver locket. Inside, a tiny photo of Captain Everett, smiling in uniform. On the back, an inscription, "Until we meet again, T.E." The pieces were falling in two. Place. Clara had survived. At least for a while. Someone had brought her belongings back. Perhaps even she herself, hidden by shame, trauma, or injury. But why had she never made contact? And how had the locket ended up in the family's possession? Margaret knew there was more, still buried beneath layers of silence, and the diary might hold the key. Later that evening, Margaret sat on her motel bed, diary open, fingers gently turning the delicate pages. Clara's handwriting grew shakier with each entry, as if her strength was slowly waning. Outside, the wind rustled the oaks, and a train's whistle howled far off, haunting and lonely, like the story unfolding in her hands. One entry caught her eye, dated September 17th, 1917. It read, "We were ordered to evacuate the station near Cambrai. Shelling hasn't stopped in 2 nights. I bandaged 15 men in 1 hour, hands shaking, heart hollow. A man named Jean said he saw Thomas, said he was injured, but alive. I'm clinging to that. If I don't write again, let this book tell someone I was here. I loved him. I didn't run. I stayed." Margaret closed the diary and exhaled. There it was. Clara had remained at her post under bombardment, surrounded by wounded soldiers and chaos. She hadn't abandoned her duty. And then, silence. The entries stopped. She didn't know whether Clara had died that week, or had been taken, or had hidden. But someone had returned the diary to the farmhouse. Someone had placed it under that bed, and someone knew the truth. Margaret decided to visit the Veterans Archive Center in town the next day, hoping to find records of Clara's service, or of anyone named Thomas Everett. The building was small, but a kind archivist named Marlene welcomed her warmly. 1917. Marlene whistled. "You're looking for needles in haystacks, sweetheart, but let's dig." They searched digital registries, old scanned ledgers, and, finally, a crumbling personnel list from the American Red Cross's WWI deployment roster. Margaret's eyes widened as a name appeared. Clara Monroe, Station France, arrived March 1917. Status, missing in action, October 1917, that's her. Margaret whispered. Marlene nodded. Not many women from this county served back then. She was one of only 3. And Thomas Everett? Margaret asked. Marlene typed the name. Here. Thomas R. Everett, 3rd Infantry Division. Injured near Verdun, evacuated late 1917. Returned to the States in 1918. Margaret's breath caught. He had survived. She leaned forward. Was he ever interviewed, or did he leave a will? Marlene checked a few indexes. There's something, a letter he donated to the State War Letters collection before he died in 1942. It's held in Richmond. Margaret's heart pounded. She knew what she had to do. That weekend she drove the 3 hours to Richmond, barely noticing the rain streaking the windshield. At the archives desk, she requested the Everett letter. The attendant returned with a plastic sleeve holding a single folded sheet. Yellowed but intact. It was dated January 12, 1918. To whoever finds this, her name was Clara Monroe. She saved my life, though I never saw her again. I asked everyone. I searched every station. I even bribed officers to check the dead. I couldn't find her, but I kept her letter, and this locket. I pray someone someday knows she mattered. She was brave. Braver than I ever was. If there is a heaven, she's in it. I only wish I could have said goodbye. Margaret blinked back tears. It was all true. Clara had stayed. She had tended to the wounded until her own light faded. Thomas had loved her until his last breath. And somehow, their story had been preserved, scattered in diaries, medals, photos, and now, a voice reading her story aloud. She glanced at the diary in her lap. There was one last passage she hadn't read, one final entry, on a separate sheet tucked behind the cover. If anyone finds this, I was never afraid to die, only to be forgotten. Margaret pressed the page to her chest. You won't be forgotten, she whispered. Not ever. After returning home, Margaret sat in her living room surrounded by notes, old photographs, the diary, and photocopies of Thomas Everett's letter. The room was quiet, save for the ticking clock above the fireplace. The weight of Clara's story pressed heavily on her, not just as a tale of love or loss, but as a reminder of how many voices from history had never been heard. But Clara had spoken through ink, through time. Margaret couldn't rest until she gave Clara a voice that echoed beyond the yellowed pages of a forgotten diary. The next morning, Margaret visited the University of Virginia's Historical Research Department. She met with Dr. Helen Rivers, a professor who specialized in women's roles during wartime. I brought something that I think needs to be preserved, Margaret said, placing the diary on the table. Helen adjusted her glasses and flipped through it slowly. Her eyes widened. This is incredible, she murmured. It's rare to find such an intact and emotionally raw account from a field nurse. Most were lost or destroyed. This is a first-hand lens into 1917, into the trenches, into the human heart. She looked up. You said it was found under a bed. Margaret nodded. In a farmhouse in Albemarle County. The family who owned it didn't know who she was. I only figured it out after weeks of searching. Helen leaned back, thoughtful. Clara's story deserves to be shared. With your permission, we could archive it, transcribe it, and maybe even publish excerpts in our upcoming exhibition on women in war. Tears prickled at the corners of Margaret's eyes. That's all I want, for people to remember her. Later, that week, while preparing materials for the university, Margaret dug deeper. She contacted local historians, descendants of the Monroe family, and even visited the Monroe Cemetery. There, nestled between crumbling stones, she found a simple marker. Clara Monroe, 1892 to 1917, gone in service, not in vain. Fresh flowers rested at the base. Margaret knelt, tracing the engraving with her fingers. Someone had remembered her, perhaps a cousin, or maybe even Thomas himself. Back at home, she received a call from Helen. "We've translated and digitized the diary," she said. "There's something at the very end we didn't notice before." Pressed between the last page and the back cover, Margaret's heart skipped. "What is it?" "A locket. Tiny, silver, tarnished. Inside was a photo of Clara and a man in uniform. It matches an image we found of Thomas Everett in his regiment file." Margaret gasped. They had been photographed together, proof of their connection, of a moment shared before the war shattered everything. Helen continued, "We're preparing a small memorial display. Would you be willing to attend and speak about how you found the diary?" Margaret clutched the phone. "Yes, absolutely." When the day of the exhibition came, dozens gathered at the university's War Memorial Hall. Photographs lined the walls, black and white images of nurses, letters, dog tags, and now, Clara's diary, carefully preserved in glass. Margaret stepped up to the podium. "I didn't know Clara Munro, not until I stumbled across her story, but I know what she stood for. Courage, devotion, sacrifice." She paused, voice trembling. Clara was afraid of being forgotten. Today, she is remembered. The crowd rose in applause, some wiping away tears. As Margaret stood before Clara's locket and diary one last time, she whispered, "You were never just a name, you were a light." And for the first time in decades, Clara's voice, tender, brave, and quietly enduring, echoed again through the halls of history. 2 months after the exhibition, Margaret received an unexpected letter. The envelope was aged, sealed with a faded wax crest, and postmarked from Amherst, Massachusetts. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dear Miss Walker, my name is Louise Everett. My grandfather was Thomas Everett, the man you mentioned at the memorial. My family had no idea about Clara Munro until your speech. My grandmother passed years ago, and my father rarely spoke of the war. But I found something in our attic that I think belongs with Clara's story." Attached was a photograph. It showed Clara and Thomas, arm in arm, standing before a field hospital tent. Clara wore her nurse's cap. Thomas, his officer's uniform. They were smiling, truly smiling, despite the world collapsing around them. The back read, "June 1917, just before the orders came." Margaret's hands trembled. She hadn't expected closure, but here it was, gently unfolding through time. Later that week, Louise called. "My grandfather rarely spoke of the war," she said softly, "but he wrote once that he had loved a woman named Clara. He thought she had died in a German bombing, I believe. He never truly healed from that loss." Louise had more. She had found letters, dozens of them, all from Clara, bundled in twine, preserved in an old cigar box. The letters were dated from early 1917 to October, the month she was presumed missing. "I think he couldn't bring himself to throw them away," Louise said. Margaret traveled to Amherst, where she met Louise in person. In a cozy book-filled study, they sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully opening each letter. Clara's words were radiant, sometimes playful, often weary, always vivid. She spoke of the wounded, the night sounds of artillery, the camaraderie of nurses, the dampness of the tents, the desperate hope in soldiers' eyes, and her longing to see Thomas again. But it was her final letter that left them silent. October 8, 1917, "Dearest Thomas, if you're reading this, I must have made it to the hospital in The train is delayed, and we've been advised to wait out the shelling in Amiens. It's getting worse. I don't know if I'll make it through this week, but I wanted to tell you, I'm not afraid, because I knew love. I knew you. Keep me in your memories. That's all I ask. Your Clara." Louise wept. "He never got this," she whispered. "It must have been lost in the chaos." Margaret nodded. "But now, it found its way home." That winter, the University of Virginia updated the exhibit. Now, alongside the diary and locket, were Clara's letters, Thomas's photo, and the final letter that had never been delivered. Thousands visited. Teachers brought students, survivors of war came to pay quiet respect. One visitor left a note in the guest book. "My great-aunt was a nurse during WWI. She never talked about it. Thank you for giving a voice to so many who never got to tell their story." Margaret knew then that her journey with Clara had changed her. Not just as a historian, but as a woman, a daughter, a granddaughter of a generation of women who carried more than the world ever saw. And now, those voices echoed again, Through pages, through tears, through tears, through time, Clara Monroe was never listed among official casualties of World War I. No grave bears her name, no statue marks her sacrifice, and yet, through a forgotten diary, a box of unsent letters, and a locket hidden in dust, her voice returned quiet, steady, and full of grace. In the years that followed, her story inspired research into other unnamed nurses who vanished during the war. A memorial was erected not for heroes with medals, but for those whose stories were nearly lost. Clara's name was the first engraved. Margaret Walker continued her work as a historian, now specializing in personal war testimonies. But Clara remained, her most haunting discovery, a woman who never made it home, yet reached across generations with her words and her love. As for Louise Everett, she donated the last of Thomas's possessions, a pressed flower found in one of Clara's letters. She said he'd kept it in his wallet until the day he died. Clara may have disappeared from the battlefield, but her story, like so many women's stories, waited patiently to be heard until someone listened. If Clara's story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell us which part touched your heart most. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who still believes in the power of memory. Because some voices, no matter how long they've been silent, deserve to echo forever.